your attention. We realize it's kind of, some of it is our tiny, kind of tedious little snippets, but we tried to include a variety to give kind of an idea of what is in this book and also about the button and why we like them. Does anybody have any questions? Please ask a question. Yes, Leta.
Can you tell us about the Rudolph collection at the historic costume?
I would love to tell you about that collection. Right across the street at this historic costume and textile collection is a fantastic button collection that was put together by a lady named Anne Rudolph. It was her husband was head of the botany department here, and she was a research librarian at Battelle. She had a wonderful collection. When they both died, it was donated to the university, and it has been restored and is cataloged and lives in a wonderful air-conditioned, climate-controlled area of that building, of Campbell Hall. And it's available for research and study and just love of beauty. It's very complete and is a real benefit for anyone who's looking at any of the facets that involve buttons. Whether it would be people putting on plays, trying to mimic the costumes of the time, or if it's somebody that just wants to look at the art in miniature, because there are a lot of buttons there that fall into the art in miniature category. They're very lovely. It's a very, very fine collection. Anybody here play with buttons when you were kids? Anybody's mother or grandma have a button box? Sure they do, sure.
I skipped that. I'm supposed to say that.
No, that's okay. I think that was an okay thing to do, but I think we probably, many of us had grandparents or parents that had a button box, and we didn't throw things away as much in the past as we do now. We didn't take off a shirt and throw it in the trash. The shirt was worn out, the buttons were cut off, and they were put in the button box, and they were reused on another garment. And we didn't have Velcro, so buttons were pretty essential to keep your blouse closed or keep your pants up. In fact, there's an interesting little story in this about the disintegration of tin at certain temperatures. It's strictly a chemical process that I didn't know existed, but I think it was Napoleon's army. Was it Napoleon's army? Somebody's army in Russia, Napoleon's, had these tin buttons, and in the very cold winter, all the buttons deteriorated, and these soldiers had trouble keeping their pants up because their pants buttons were all gone. So it became a utilitarian need, and it was gone.
I found something sort of illuminating when you talked about buttons not being worn by women because they were considered loose. I had a friend who was in a religious order. She was maybe 15 or more years older than me. And she told me that every day they had to sew part of their habit on them. They did not have buttons in certain parts of the habit. And I never knew why, but I bet it was from,
from the old tradition, the old culture. And we know that some of the Mennonite and Amish groups don't use buttons or didn't. I think that some of that is evolving, but in the past, the Amish didn't have buttons. They used pins or hooks. And in actually a lot of the early times in this country, the women had hooks and eyes on their clothing rather than buttons that actually buttoned. And then it got very extravagant, and during the Civil War time, those dresses had buttons that went all the way down the front. So it's a fashion trend. The buttons come and go just like the fashions do, and we love them all.
And they would also use thorns. They would use thorns to fasten their clothing from the trees and pieces of metal. In fact, during the Depression, there was an expression, use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without. And that was pretty common and was something that I know you heard and I heard. Having a button box was mandatory. It was necessary. And now, when we're looking for buttons, if we find a button box, we find a nice button box. I know the other day I looked and I drove halfway across town to find somebody was recommending they had antique buttons, and I got really excited about it, but they weren't antique buttons to me. They were plastics and mother of pearls, and they weren't the kind that we desire to collect and search and hope to find.
And as we collect more, we get picky, and that's just
Yes.
the way it is. But we don't find many buttons at garage sales or even antique stores. If we find a button in an antique store, it's probably way too expensive. We buy most of our buttons either online from dealers who are online, or at a button show from dealers who come from wherever and we have dealers that come from out of state. Most of them come from out of state and bring their buttons and sell buttons. And they're very knowledgeable, they know what they're selling, and they're reliable. But that's where we buy most of our buttons. We don't find, but as we get more discerning, thank you, we aren't able to find much at a garage sale. Sometimes, now I bought a jar of buttons over at Springfield Mall the other day for $45, and it didn't have much in it, and that was money that I could have much better spent buying one nice button. But I had fun going through them, so that kept me busy for a while. In fact, they're all over my desk right now.
And we always anticipate, the lady will say, I have some for you, and you'll think, okay, I'll call her. Well, I can't find them right now, but it's always the thrill of the hunt is a lot of fun. And trading, once we decide we're just not going to specialize in a certain kind, when we find the kind that somebody else wants, we can trade. And so that's something to look forward to. And for some reason or other, I find that men are especially attracted to military buttons.
They are, and it's very interesting how many men collect buttons. And I thought that when I first started collecting, I thought that the men were collecting buttons were only doing it for an investment. And that's not true. I've found out as I've gotten to know those people. Most of them are very, very passionately interested in what they're collecting. They like the history of it. They're very serious collectors, and it's just amazing how many men collect buttons. That was a surprise to me. I thought, oh, well, he's doing that for an investment. Instead of putting his money in a bank, he's buying buttons. So, but that's not the way it is. It's very interesting. And people from all walks of life collect buttons. I have met so many people that I never would have met from all different areas of life had I not been involved in button collecting. It's just a kind of a fun interest that brings a lot of people together, and we have such a commonality that we become friends very quickly and easily.
And there's associated items too. I started out with buttons, and because I couldn't find any, I had a few button hooks, and so I thought, well, I'll start collecting button hooks. And so I began buying button hooks, and they come in silver and steel and all kinds of metal, and some of them have jewels and things like that, and they're sometimes a lot less expensive than even just one button. So I collected a variety of button hooks, and all of a sudden I got a button hook that was about this long, and it had a ring at the end. And I wondered, what was that for? And it turns out that button hooks were worn on chatelaines, which are a type of jewelry that women wore in the late 1800s and the early 1900s for the dance, or for buttoning, or for sewing, or for the desk. And then men also began to gather them with their knives and their keys and all. So just because of a button, I now have button hooks and chatelaines along with my buttons. So it's kind of infectious. Gets under your skin.
Yes?
My grandfather used to tell my mother, my grandfather died when my mother was 12, but he used to tell stories to them of his father. My grandfather was born in 1899, and he grew up in the very early York, and he would tell stories of his father and how he was a customs officer on the border between Yugoslavia and Italy, and how he would sit for hours and just polish his buttons. And as a kid, I hear all these stories, and it always amazed me that people had such respect for buttons, and we all have our button boxes in every household, like you said. Even if it was a generational thing that was revered and held on to, even into the mid-20th century, which surprised me, because as a kid I was always kind of amazed, like, what's the big deal? It's just buttons. But
Right.
Apparently they have a lot more impact and were more significant to people in earlier days, and that sense of them was carried over.
The cultural significance of buttons was what really attracted my interest when I started looking at buttons. That they were so important in different cultural aspects and different cultural periods. And that, of course, went right back to the history, which I never learned much about when I was taking history courses in school. But I certainly got involved in history later, and I have learned a lot from looking up and studying about certain buttons and the certain periods of the people that wore them and that they were reflective of. So it's very interesting. It's a good hobby, and it's and people say, well, it doesn't take much room. Well, it does take a lot of room, because buttons seem to grow, and you think you don't have many, and then all of a sudden you have 6 boxes of them, and then you have 12 boxes. So they do take room, but it's not as if you're collecting something that's really big. Yes, sir.
I came a little late, so you may have answered this at the beginning, but for your collection, I guess each of you may have a different system.
Mm-hmm.
How do you, let's say, organize and classify buttons? So is it by where they're from, how old they are, and how big they are, how many holes they have in them?
Yes.
If I go to your house and
Yes.
you have a certain wall that's just 1800s, 4 holes, metal, European. Or
Yes and no. There are many. You can classify in any way that one wants to. There are people who keep track of their buttons by color. That's a pretty basic way to start, but people do. I try to keep track of them by material and by theme. So this tray that I brought, these are all pearl. They're all on shell. And so I would have all the cards, or maybe a drawer. I keep a lot of buttons in those little drawers that mechanics use that have those pull-out plastic drawers. So I would have my pearl buttons hopefully in drawers together. And the better ones I would have on cards that would look like this. And so these are all pearl, and these happen to be all before World War I. They're called Division I in our category. And before World War I is when things were more handmade. After World War I, there started to be more machine-made and less handwork. So that became a turning point in identifying buttons. This is another group of buttons. This was also a competition tray, and the theme on this competition was Asian buttons. And I brought these because they're so pretty and colorful. But these show all different kinds of material. There's a beautiful enamel button from China. There's a Satsuma button from Japan. So they're all different Asian countries, but the common theme is Asian. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
And those on the other pearl button, they're all smalls.
These are all small size.
There are large ones, but that
these are
happened
all
to be
small. And these
all
all
smalls.
have 2 holes sewed through, not 4 hole, but 2 hole. And that's a category of competition that's coming up at a button show in a couple weeks. So I brought this because I put this tray together and it turned out kind of nice.
Okay, so as a follow-up, you mentioned category 1, but so there is sort of a consensus in the community of
There are
dividing lines that are temporal, that are
There are criteria,
Yeah.
Okay.
and they're put together by the national committees.
Okay.
A lot of
And
high
he also lists the Bible of the reference book there.
Oh,
The
the
two
two
reference
reference
books,
books,
yeah,
yes.
yeah.
But the criteria are put together by the National Club's hierarchy, and that actually outlines, if you go into competition, it outlines exactly what the criteria are, what you need to have in order to be accepted for a certain competition award. And our competition awards, usually the first prize is $5, so we don't give it Are there any other questions? I like that. Yes, Leta.
What is the most expensive button in the world?
Most expensive button? Well, probably a Washington inaugural. When George Washington was elected, don't you think so?
I would guess so, yes.
When he was elected,
In great demand, yeah.
they had imprinted these metal buttons that were given out, and they were actually worn on garments. And there are a number of different designs of them. A lot of them say GW, have different patterns. And I know those sell for between $3,000 and $5,000 a piece. I have a set of duplicates. They're just copies that were made they're probably 50 years old, but they are not worth very much at all. But the actual original buttons, of course, and it's very easy to tell. Once you look at these buttons a little bit, you can tell what's original and what's a duplicate. You can tell. When I first started to collect buttons, this lady who was helping me was blind, and I would say, "Is this old or new?" And she'd just feel it and feel the shank. And she said, "This is an old button. This is not an old button," because she could tell by feeling the size and the thickness of the shank,
yeah.
that it was not newly made.
The most expensive one that was found in the Rudolph collection was identified by Johnson, Fraser, and I believe it was a Confederate Navy button.
Yes.
There weren't very many.
It was a Confederate Navy button.
Yeah.
That's right. The Confederate buttons were very primitive. Not very many of the Confederate soldiers or sailors wore them, just the higher officers. So to find that Navy button, that's right, that's very right. And we don't really know the value of that, but that would be
over 1,500, wasn't it?
Oh, it would be in the thousands, I think.
Oh, okay.
I think it would be in the probably several thousand, because it was that rare, very fine quality, and it was interesting because we found it just laying loose on the top of a bunch of other stuff. So that's the intrigue of going through buttons, because you never know what you might find. And you don't usually find that quality, do you?
No, you don't. But the search is
the search is right.
The joy.
The search is the joy.
The anticipation. Yeah. Thank you.
We have really enjoyed talking to you,
This was
and
a lot
also
of fun.
this was good, and we've enjoyed your enthusiasm, because it's late in the afternoon, and it's we have had, as I say, we had a lot of tedious information that we thought, well, we can't cut everything out, but we'll try to make it interesting. So we appreciate your attention and your questions especially. I just have to put in a little plug and say we do have a local club. We meet once a month at the Hilliard Library. And we have a fun group, and if anybody has grandma's button collection or a button box that they would like to sort out and figure out, we have a website. The Ohio Button Club has a website, and it's ohiobuttons.org. It gives name and location of all the meetings and things that go on.
Buckeye State Button Society.